I was having a little bit of a fish don't know they're wet moment this week. You know how that is, when it's like somebody points out something to you and you're like, it's obvious to everybody but you type of thing. See, I'd worked at this congregation once upon a time where some of us on staff, and this was kind of just our joke on the staff, is we had made sermon bingo cards. So it was all the ticks and all the stories that those of us in the preaching rotation kept going back to. So, for instance, whenever anybody mentioned the finest university in all of North Dakota, or, living in Boston or Detroit, some others had on the preaching rotation, you joke about that was what was on the bingo card. So a friend of mine texted me this, found her old copy, texted it to me on Monday or so, and everybody in our house had a huge laugh over it. And then, of course, you know what happened next. Lorianne and the boys started drawing up one with my current set of verbal tics and things I keep coming back to. And of course, first thing on the list is trolling Packers fans, because if you didn't want me to do it, it wouldn't be so much fun, okay? But then they went and listed 3 or 4 other things. And I'm looking at it like, yeah, that's fair, that's fair, that's fair. Like, really? I don't know. And we had this long discussion about something they said, I say, and I'm like, I don't think I do. And so we went back and forth, and I'm like, all right, we're just going to have to go to the tape and see if I actually say it in the future. We'll go from there. But I tell you that story because it's an interesting way of looking at this passage. And that passage reveals something in us for this very same issue. See, the passage Ms. Urkel had just read for us is part of Paul's journeys. In the book of Acts, we get all his stories of him going to different places and preaching and teaching and telling people about Jesus. And here he is in Athens, and he's at this place called Mars Hill. Sometimes you're reading a translation, it says, I can't even say it in Greek. It's like Erigapis, or beyond my mind, even if I did go to the finest university in all of North Dakota. I did, it is. But sometimes it'll say that in Greek, and sometimes your translation will render it in Mars Hill. I always just say Mars Hill. Mars Hill was this hill that had a temple to the Roman god Mars. And it was the place where the Stoics and the philosophers went because they would there argue about philosophy and everything else, because there's no Hulu, no Netflix, no Disney Plus. And everybody would go there to watch these guys argue and discuss. And it was this fascinating place. And what happens is Paul sees all these different things, and he sees these altars, and he sees this altar to an unknown God. And this is where it gets interesting. Because the way it worked in this system when you were a polytheist is you would go and thank whichever god you thought had done you a favor. So if you just came back from the war and you were safe and you had all your limbs, you'd go to the god of war and you would make a sacrifice to Mars. If your ship comes in bearing the stuff you've been waiting for, you'd go down and you make a sacrifice to Poseidon. But what happens if something good happens and you don't know which god to thank? Now, this is where the Athenians were pretty smart. They knew these Greek gods were notoriously petty and sensitive and always looking for a slight. So they said, let's make ourselves an altar to an unknown god. So when something good happens and you don't know which god did it, you go down to the altar, you make a sacrifice, the god's happy, you're happy, everybody's happy except for the animal that just got sacrificed, and it's all good. And what Paul does is he goes to this, and he goes to Mars Hill, and he says, look, you've got an altar to this unknown God. I see you're indeed religious. Let's talk about this unknown God. And he quotes the Greek poets, and he says, some of your poets even say we are his offspring. And you say we live and we breathe and we have our being and our existence in him. And what he's doing is he's using their language, their poetry, their philosophy, and using that to point to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The God who sent his only son, Jesus, to die for our sins and to make everything right. Now, let's take a second, and I want to give you the traditional sermon that we hear on this passage. And it's a good sermon, and I enjoy it. It's one of my favorite passages to preach on. But then what I want to do is I want to take it and turn it 90 degrees. Here's what I mean. The traditional message you hear on this is that we need to find common ground and common points of contact with people who are different than us so we can share who Jesus is. And that's a good message. If you're visiting some other church and they're preaching on this and they're talking that language, pay attention. It's good stuff. Because for us in churches, it is so easy to get forted up and say we're not going to deal with those people who have a different culture, a different value system, a different beliefs. And we're just going to be here. And when I was on internship in Seattle, the neighborhood had changed and things had changed, and the congregation is just like, we don't know what to do. We don't know how to talk to these people. And we just don't know where to go. But conversely, when I was in Toledo, the neighborhood had changed over and there was a lot of ethnic changes, class changes, everything else had changed in that area where that congregation was. But something wonderful happened there. That congregation said, you know what? We are right next door to an elementary school. We are right next door to this place where people send their kids. And people love their kids. And people care about their kids. And we want to care and love for their kids too. So this congregation had this really neat tradition, and it expanded and grew in the time I was there. I can't claim credit for it, but I can claim I was there. That we started saying, hey, let's give away backpacks every fall with school supplies, because there's a lot of kids in this neighborhood that can't afford that. There's a lot of kids who are just getting by barely. Let's send some of our people over to the elementary school and tutor them. And it was neat because we had this great relationship with the principal right next door. And he would let us come in and tutor the kids and give away stuff and just say, look, you matter to Jesus. Therefore, you matter to us. And it was such a great way of saying, this is your value. Let us show you how it fits in with who Jesus has called us to be. And we had some great conversations with that. And that's the traditional message you hear out of this passage. And it's a great one. And I want to encourage you in that. But I want to twist it a little bit to think about this a different way. You see, I think the issue presenting to us here in this congregation and in Washington County is not so much ethnic or class, but I think it's generation to generation. See, I've been thinking about this a lot, both because it's high school senior Sunday, we did the church health assessment last year, and there's just a lot of reasons this has been on my mind. But I want to talk about how it is sometimes so easy for us to write off other generations and not realize we're even doing it. I came of age in peak baby boomer nostalgia. Okay? I have heard more than one sermon start with these words, do you remember where you were when you heard that JFK was shot? Now, for some of you, you're like, oh, I know where I was. But for a lot of us, we're like, no. And for me, back in the 90s, I would be sitting there listening to a sermon start out that way, and I would just like, this guy, inevitably it was a guy, you got no concept that there's people here in this place that don't get that. Fish don't know they're wet. And so often, our generational assumptions are that we think in this pattern, like the people around us, of our cohort, our colleagues, friends, family, of that generation. And we don't realize that there's other ways to think. Let's explore this for a minute. Paul has this really interesting conversation with Timothy. Writes this letter. And you see both sides of it. You see how Paul is telling Timothy, we need each other. Paul starts out this letter saying, look, you were raised in the faith by your mother and your grandmother and those saints that came before you. You need their wisdom and experience and love. And that is a wonderful challenge for us. Let me tell you this story. back in the day when we started out, when we were young in ministry, we were down in Texas, and we had this church planting coach. His name was Bob, and he was phenomenal. And he had started 8 churches, and then he had gone into coaching. And he was taking all that wisdom and everything else to help people like us. And what was amazing, what I loved so much about him, is I could call him up, and I'd say, Bob, I got this great idea. And I'd explain it to him. And he'd say, Mike. And he'd say it with this thick Oklahoma accent I cannot even begin to imitate. And he would say, Mike, that's a great idea, and I love your enthusiasm. But have you thought about this? And I'm like, oh, no, I haven't. He'd say, well, what about this? And he'd say, have you thought about your nursery, or you thought about this? And I'm like, oh, yeah, that's a good point. And he said, well, what about would the implications be for this part of your ministry if you do that? Yeah. And I'd spend like a half an hour on the phone with him, and I'm like, thank you, Bob. That was a stupid idea, and I'm so glad you told me. And it was funny because he would ask these questions, and because he had this wealth of experience. And he could just say to me, well, Mike, what do you think about it? And I'm like, oh, yeah. And it was awesome. I loved it. And he never talked down to me, never just like, you're an idiot, man. But it was just always, how is that going to work? And it was so helpful. But here's the thing. We need each other. We need each generation. In that same letter to Timothy, Paul writes, don't let anyone look down at you because you're young, but set an example in faith and love and charity. Now, we often truncate that to don't let anybody look down at you because you're young, but it's the second half that does the work. Set an example. I had a youth guy I worked with a long time ago, and he made this very important point. He said, every church he'd been a part of, and when I thought about it, applied to my experience too, every church he had ever been a part of, it was the youth that started mission trips. It was the youth that set the example. Now I will tell you this. My home church, the church I grew up at, there was literally in the 90s and the aughts, and I'm sure it's continuing to this day, but they would send out literal mobs of 100 people on a mission trip to places like Jamaica, do this amazing work and do all this great stuff. And do you know how it started? It started with a bunch of teenagers going to Florida and Colorado to build houses for Habitat Humanity. And I still remember those days of driving on that bus that was not air conditioned. I remember waking up somewhere in the middle of Illinois and saying, I think I found a new definition of hell. Believe it or not, I've calmed down since I was younger. I could say that on a church trip. It was fun. But the point is, we need each of those generations. We need the experience and the wisdom of the people who've done it, and we need the energy and the enthusiasm of the people who don't know what's impossible. And we need to talk and to share those stories and that wisdom and that enthusiasm, which is why I am so excited by a day like today. But let's flip it out. Let's talk about life beyond these walls. It is so easy for us to look at people outside and say, they drive me crazy and there's no hope for them. And I have heard that from our senior citizens and our more veteran members, and I've heard that for younger people. And they will look and they will say, can you believe these kids today? Can you believe what they're doing? Can you believe this? So there's no motivation, no, whatever, pick your thing. Or can you say, these younger folks, say, can you believe these older people and what they're doing and how they're never going to change and they're never going to let anybody else do everything and they're never going to let go of power? And you know what? Every single one of them is right to a certain place, but they're wrong in the bigger way. Every single person you meet, regardless of what year they were born, is a child of God and is made in the image of God. And Jesus died for them and for their sins just as much as he died for yours and for mine. And our call should be to meet each one of them where they're at. Should be to say to them, hey, let's talk about these things. Let me give you some good news from an unexpected place. I was reading this really interesting article last year. Strictly secular article, strictly about politics, nothing at all about church. But there's a little bit of wisdom in here that we can take. It was asking older voters, like people 55 and up, younger voters, people in their 20s and 30s, what their core issues were, what the things that they were looking at, what the biggest problems they thought with the country were at. And you know what? They were the same. It was all the stuff that if I ask you, what are the issues that you think are biggest facing the country? Crime, education, inflation, all that stuff. Everybody's looking at it like, yeah, it's the same thing. Human nature has not changed since the dawn of time. And if you're looking at something thinking this is probably an issue, this is ugly, there's probably people around you of every generation thinking the same thing. It was really interesting. My mom's mom, I remember their house was always immaculate. We go up to go visit her, and it was always a perfect house. But she had a lot of stuff and never threw anything that might be valuable away. And I remember talking to my mother about this, and she says, you got to remember, your grandma lived through the Great Depression. Yeah. And it's funny because I appreciate the way that history keeps coming back. And some of those behaviors that we saw back then, those people who lived through the Great Depression, the people living through the Great Recession, people living through inflation now, they leave their scars. But the good news is it lets us work through these things with each other. It lets us say to each other, hey, what are you dealing with now? How did you get through it back in the day? It lets us say, you know what? Our hope is in Jesus, even though these situations are tough. And the beautiful thing as Christians and what we look at through this story of Paul is we can say, you know what? We know the truth. We know Jesus died for our sins. But how we articulate that, how we talk about that, it's going to play out a little different with each generation. And that is so freeing to be able to say that. To be able to love the people and say, you know what, you're different than I am. But that's okay. Because Jesus died for both of us. And we can go forward and share that love with everyone else. Amen.